Israel and Hamas still in conflict, but offering the hope seen in reunions. Hostages from one side, prisoners from the other back home. The ceasefire, the long-term intentions, and the dangers involved. We're asking for the view from an American lawmaker and warrior, Representative Michael Waltz, the only Green Beret serving in Congress. Plus, we'll go to state legislation. Clay County's Sam Garrison is a leader in the Florida House. His view on the upcoming legislative session and why mental health is his #1 priority for the state on This Week in Jacksonville. Conflict continues in the Middle East, even following the temporary truce negotiated. That truce allowed for the release of dozens of hostages, along with about twice as many Palestinians set free from prisons. I spoke this week with Michael Waltz, the only U.S. Army Green Beret serving in the House of Representatives. I asked for his view on the war and the ceasefire and what's next.
I am so happy for those that have been reunited with their loved ones that were held hostage. But the longer Hamas drags this out, the more it is a military advantage for them. They are using this time to resupply, restock, rearm, and get ready for the next round of fighting with the Israelis. And while we need to get our Americans out, we also need to let the Israelis do what they need to do to eliminate this threat.
So many voices on this side of the ocean saying, no, Palestinians shouldn't be killed in this. There's an element of Hamas using Palestinians as human shields. Is that right?
Hamas has historically, as has Hezbollah, the Taliban, ISIS, and others, used humans as human shields, use civilians, and that we have to make the distinction between terrorists targeting civilians, as they did on October 7th, torturing, beheading, killing civilians deliberately as a means of psychological warfare, versus what's happening now in Gaza, where civilians are used as human shields and killed as part of collateral damage. I know for certain the Israeli Defense Forces are doing everything they can to avoid civilian casualties, because they know that Hamas's main objective is to turn global opinion against Israel, to use these civilian casualties as propaganda against Israel, and frankly, Hamas is very good at doing that. So Israel's doing everything it can to avoid the civilian casualties, but at the end of the day, in order to eliminate the threat, they have to do what they have to do, and it's heartbreaking. And that the civilians at the end of the day suffer.
Where do you stand, Congressman, on the aid that America provides, in this case, to Israel and also to Ukraine? Because both of those conflicts are places where there's becoming some dissension in Congress about which should be funded and how much.
Well, Kent, we also have to add the aid into Gaza. And what is so frustrating to me is that we also know that Hamas siphons off that aid for its fighters. It takes the fuel, the medical supplies, the other resources that we're sending in. We have no way of verifying that the terrorist organization is actually giving that to the civilians that are suffering. And we know that they use it to rearm and resupply its own war machine. And so, on the one hand, you have the Biden administration saying, well, we got to have conditions, and you have Democrats in Congress saying we should condition aid to Israel. Well, how about you condition aid that we know the terrorists are stealing and using to attack Israel, that are coming from American and international sources? So that's the frustration there. Look, at the end of the day, I think all aid that the American people pay for and provide should have conditions on it. We just don't give blank checks to anyone. But I fully trust the Israeli military, a functioning democracy with a long history of abiding by human rights, to abide by the laws of war far more than I do a terrorist organization that deliberately targets, kidnaps, and tortures civilians.
What do you think the next steps are there? And obviously, America is interested in seeing a resolution, but in your view, how does it resolve in Israel?
Well, look, just in terms of the aid, just to finish that thought, in terms of the aid, we need to take care of our border first. And that's our position in the House Republicans is, look, we're going to support our allies. We have to stop Putin. We need to stop terrorism in the Middle East. But we've got to stop the 2 to 3 million people from all over the world that are flowing across our border, unchecked, unvetted. The FBI director is ringing the alarm bells, says he nearly has 200 investigations of the terrorist watch list in cities across the United States. I don't know what it's going to take for President Biden to actually secure our border absent another terrorist attack. And when that happens, he will have blood on his hands, because the FBI is telling us it's only a matter of time before one of these terrorists that are on the terrorist watch list actually operationalize an attack.
We saw early this last week that I believe border control in I think it was Tucson, but in Arizona, southern Arizona, said 13,500 illegal crossings happened there. I think they said in a single day. That sounds like exaggeration. Is that true?
No, that's the reports that we're getting. I mean, we're looking at 2 million per year the last 3 years. That's upwards of 6 million people. I mean, what is that? 6 Orlandos that have been created by people we have no idea where they came from. And then you have the gotaways. That's another at least 1 million a year. So this is just completely out of control. By the way, the human smugglers and the cartels that are doing this, according to international NGOs, sexually abuse or sell the girls into human trafficking at a rate of 40 to 50%. Do the math on that. The amount of young girls that are being sexually assaulted and sold into human trafficking rings, they're enriching themselves to the tune of billions. We've got to start taking them on. We haven't even talked about the fentanyl crisis that are killing more people per year than we lost in Vietnam in our inner cities. And that's why I've introduced a bill for us to use military resources, not an invasion of Mexico. I'm talking satellites, cyber, drones, and other means to go after the cartels, disrupt them, and put them on their back foot. But we've got to take this crisis on.
Military service, close to your heart, obviously, with what your career has been. How do you feel about what Senator Tommy Tuberville has been doing in terms of blocking promotions for the military, using that as a political tactic?
Well, look, we have to go back to what started this. And I can tell you, we requested last year that the Pentagon not go down this road of funding the travel and lodging for people that feel like they need to get late-term abortions. We said, you are going to put a poison pill in our entire defense process, and someone is going to object. They did it anyway. They did it right before the midterm elections, and they did it for political reasons because they wanted to keep abortion on the headlines. And I think that's truly unfortunate. Look, I wish that Senator Tuberville had limited his objection to political appointees and not necessarily generals. But look, I get his point in that this is a violation of the law. It is against the law to use taxpayer resources to fund and resource people to go get abortions. And oh, by the way, this is the question I wish the media would ask more. How many women are we actually talking about? How many women serving the military are pregnant, don't want to continue the pregnancy, are living in a state that won't allow them, and that want a late-term abortion, and that feel like they have to travel somewhere else and use Pentagon resources? The best number that we've gotten from the Pentagon is around 10. That has caused this entire controversy. So I think this was an invented issue by the Biden administration for political reasons. They like having abortion at the top of the headline, and I think the whole situation is really unfortunate.
Representative Waltz, a combat decorated veteran, small business owner, and a former White House and Pentagon advisor. All right, up next, state lawmaker Sam Garrison is in the building. The Clay County attorney joins us. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
All right, here we are, final month of the year, and a time when so many of us take some time off. On the other hand, Lawmakers in Florida, they're gearing up for the annual legislative session, which starts this year in 2024 in January. State Representative Sam Garrison is joining us this morning. And I know as we get into this part of our conversation, we'll talk about some of your priorities for this legislative session. But there's been a lot of work that state lawmakers do in the fall leading up to what we see in session, right?
Yeah, Kent. We've been in Tallahassee for the better part of the last 2 or 3 months, kind of doing the preparatory work, getting ready so we can hit the ground running at the beginning of January. So the holidays are a nice time to decompress for a couple of weeks, but we're in the thick of it right now.
So I've got this right. Second term for you, is that right?
Yep,
yeah.
That's
So
right.
Mental health, behavioral health needs, and the budget there for behavioral health. That's one of the things that you're kind of focused on coming up.
Yeah, I'm fortunate. Speaker Renner gave me responsibility for our state's health care budget in the House, which is, I didn't know this until I got to Tallahassee. It's $45 billion. That's billion with a B. So our health care budget is enough in and of itself in Florida. We spend more on health care than 37 other states spend in their entirety on everything. So just to give you an idea of the size and the scope of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so what are some of the elements there that you're looking at? Because I would imagine, especially all that money, you got to prioritize where it's going to be spent.
A lot of the money is already allocated in terms of, existing programs like Medicaid, things like that. But one thing that's been particularly important to me is coming out of COVID, having an understanding of what we're doing in the area of mental health. You talk to any of the hospital CEOs, the frontline physicians, the ER docs, the nurses, and ask them what's been the biggest thing on their plate, the biggest challenge they're facing these last couple of years coming out of COVID. Every one of them, to a person, will say the prevalence of mental health challenges, whether from severely acute folks you see unfortunately walking the streets, just to our 11, 12, 13-year-old girls who are struggling with image issues as a result of social media. So this is an idea that this time has come. Our constituents are demanding that we start to address it. And so in the Florida House this year, we're spending a lot of efforts looking at our system that we have in place. It was designed for a pre-COVID world, a pre-social media world. And so it's going to have to look different going forward for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
I know, and we talked just briefly off air about college students and what they get to experience. So the thing about the pandemic and making some of those changes and making sure that people were able to work remotely or virtually and that students were able to do likewise. I think we're seeing the trickle down of that, right?
No question. If you talk to anybody, the pandemic taught us a lot, positively and negatively. It made a lot of us more efficient in how we do our work. I'm a lawyer. I work from home half the time, and I know a lot of my other folks do in my line of work. But when we look at the cost of the pandemic in terms of the education of our kids, both in terms of their aptitude and where they are in their learning process, but also just the social stuff that you and I take for granted, having grown up when we did. So many of our teenagers and young adults who experienced that did not have that opportunity, and it comes at a real cost. It's not as if the pandemic ended and they just pick up right where they left off. Yeah. As a society, we did some damage, and we got to figure out how best to try to build it back and give those folks a hand up.
So as I read my notes here, mental health #1 priority, but part of that is kind of trying to figure out some of the correlation there between mental health and people who don't have homes, who are experiencing homelessness.
I live in Clay County, and I used to work downtown every day at the state attorney's office for a number of years with the courthouse. We'd see each other doing the courthouse beat. Haven't come down as much as in the last 10 years or so, but when I drive down for a Jags game right now, on the way to the stadium, I notice a big difference in the number of folks who are homeless, living on the streets. My experience when I talk to folks down here who deal with that population of people, they say the overwhelming issue is substance abuse and mental health, and oftentimes in a combination thereof. And that's just not sustainable. That drains the lifeblood from a city. Florida cities are nowhere near as bad in that respect, in my opinion, as you see in San Francisco, Denver, other places. But we've got work to do, and the Florida model is different. A lot of those folks need assistance, but it's got to be a carrot and a stick. And so we're trying to figure out how best to make sure that our urban areas continue to thrive. I want downtown Jacksonville to thrive as a Clay County, and this is where my constituents work. When Jacksonville thrives, Clay County thrives, and vice versa. So we've got to do some work here, and part of it comes from the state in terms of setting the guardrails so that local governments can make their decisions. But just know this is a priority. This is how we're going to do it differently.
Well, and I hear you talking about that. In the last few weeks, we've talked to folks from Jacksonville City Council who say, hey, we've got a special committee. We're going to focus on this. Is this happening in other big cities in the state of Florida?
Sure. I think anywhere you see a population, big concentration of people, you're going to have these challenges. And I'll say this, some areas of the state have done a really good job. And I'll give a hat tip to my friends in South Florida. Miami has been really innovative in this area for a long time. They've made it a priority. And you don't see the challenges in Miami that you would expect to see of a similarly situated city of its size in other parts of the country. And so we're trying to learn some best practices and apply it to the state. Again, the goal is just to put the parameters in place of saying, hey, there's certain things that aren't going to be acceptable. It's not going to be acceptable to have a portion of downtown City Hall or the library kind of taken over and turned into de facto homeless camps. That's not going to be acceptable. But we also want to provide opportunities for folks who are willing to get help and want to get help to make sure they're able to get that hand up and get back to being productive tax-paying citizens.
You got to have that compassionate side of any kind of legislation.
It's got to be a carrot and a stick.
Yeah. All right, so stay with us, and you stay with us too. We're visiting with State Representative Sam Garrison. We're going to talk about some of the recent changes to Florida law because of last year's legislative session. Stay with us on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And welcome back to our conversation with Sam Garrison, the Clay County member of Florida's House. I wanted to talk a little bit about 2023 and what was accomplished legislatively. One of the things that I know was important to you, House Bill 1627, so that was the anti-crime, pro-public safety bill here. What did that include?
There's a number of provisions, but primarily what it said is for folks who are ultimately arrested for dangerous crimes in the state of Florida to make sure that across the state we have a uniform system for how we're going to deal with those types of cases. And primarily what it makes sure of is that individuals in that situation see a judge, a flesh and blood human being, to look at their case and make determinations about whether that person should be released on bail or not. And in situations where there are extraordinary factors, where everyone kind of agrees this is somebody who the case needs to work through the system, but they're a danger to the public, that they are in custody until such time as their case is resolved.
Is that different throughout the state? Do different circuits have different kind of guidances on that?
Very different. You know, I grew up, came to Jacksonville to be a prosecutor, served there for 10 years. It was the best 10 years of my life. Working with, you know, at the time, Sheriff Waters was a homicide sergeant when he were working on cases back together. That's probably a sign we're both getting old. But you know, the Northeast Florida model, I think, does a really good job of prioritizing, obviously, individual liberty, but not at the expense of public safety. And I just naturally assumed that everywhere else in the state was like that. Well, you get to Tallahassee real quickly, and you learn that's not the case. So that was a big reform. We had the prosecutors and the sheriffs and the public defenders and everyone kind of working together to make sure we had a product that worked for the system. But what I tell people is for folks in Northeast Florida, not that much changes. For folks in other parts of the state that don't have kind of that pro-law and order culture that we're fortunate to have here in Jacksonville and Clay County and St. Johns County, it might be a little bit different. And so, but you know, the nice thing from my perspective is we're through the process now. Heard very little, if any, complaints. The judiciary, people have gotten on board. I think people like, ultimately, having a system. Everyone knows what the rules of engagement are, and we move forward.
So I know that one of the things last year, you had worked with the First Lady, Casey DeSantis, on Florida Cancer Connect and then some mental and behavioral health issues.
Yeah, the First Lady's been a real champion on both the mental health issues we talked about earlier in the earlier segment. She calls it mental resiliency, which I think is a great word. And then also with her challenges and with being a breast cancer survivor, it's very important to her. And members of the legislature, we have a lot of folks who have been touched by losses from cancer. And so we really want to make Florida the hub nationally for a number of things in healthcare, but specifically for cancer research. And one of the things we were able to do this last year is a lot of dedicated funds that we have that go to some of our NCIC, which is National Cancer Center, designations. Mayo Clinic was able to be included as part of that right now, which is great for the state. It's great for Mayo. It's great for Jacksonville. I'm just such a fan of the work they're doing in cancer research, so it's going to benefit so many of us.
Yeah, we know MD Anderson is here in Jacksonville.
Yep.
Remind me the name of the hospital, Tampa.
Yeah, so Moffitt,
exactly.
Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Sylvester down in Miami, University of Florida. I mean, there's We have some amazing institutions here that are doing cutting-edge research to treat and prevent cancer. I'm thrilled that Mayo's part of that consortium now, and so hopefully all Floridians will benefit from it.
Only got a minute left, but tell me about this expansion of kid care that was part of 2020.
Yeah, the Florida legislature's tried to be really targeted in how we address both our Medicaid dollars and the additional dollars for folks who are working but struggling to pay insurance. And so it was a priority of Speaker Renner. His philosophy was that no one should refuse a promotion because they don't want to lose their health insurance. And so we were able to expand the kid care program to make sure the kids are the folks who are working, trying to elevate their station in life, don't suffer. We're really proud of that. Thankful for the governor for signing it. I think it's part of the Florida model for how we're doing things here.
Yeah, gotta love even the name of it. If it says kid care, okay.
Hard to vote against that, right?
It's hard to vote against that. I appreciate the time. It's great to catch up again, and we'll look forward to what happens coming up in January, February, March.
Thanks, Kent. Appreciate it.
And I'm Kent Justice, so thanks for watching on air on Channel 4, the CW17. And then you'll always find these episodes online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. Okay, next time on This Week in Jacksonville, Dr. Michael Binder from UNF is planning to join us. We're going to talk about some of the trends that he sees in the latest research from the Public Opinion Research Lab there at UNF. Plus, we dropped a brand new episode of This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition this week. It's focusing on economic development of the River City and our region every week. Well, this episode, we're looking at the incredible economic impact of UNF. President Moez Lamayan joins me. You can find new episodes every Thursday. They drop at 9 a.m., and then you're going to find it right now on News4Jax Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville. Available also wherever you find your podcasts, like Apple, Spotify, or Google.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.